Hidden in the fog-covered forests of Northern California lies one of the most feared prisons in America, a place designed not to rehabilitate, but to break the most dangerous men alive. Pelican Bay State Prison isn't just a facility, it's a world cut off from humanity. And inside its notorious security housing unit, some inmates don't see sunlight for decades. Today we go deep inside the prison California built for the gangs it couldn't control. Before Pelican Bay State Prison existed, California officials faced a crisis. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, prison gangs weren't just active. They were running entire criminal operations both inside and outside the walls. Groups like the Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia, Aryan Brotherhood, and Black Guerrilla Family controlled drug trafficking, extortion networks, and political alliances spanning dozens of facilities. They ordered hits that crossed county lines. They coordinated riots with military-like precision. And worst of all, the state had nowhere to put them where they couldn't continue operating. Traditional maximum security prisons, San Quentin, Folsom, Soledad, became battlegrounds. Yard wars killed dozens. Correctional staff were targeted, ambushed, and sometimes murdered. Officials realized something chilling. The system was losing control. So California built something new. Something extreme. Something no inmate could escape, even in spirit. In 1989, deep in the remote wilderness near Crescent City, Pelican Bay State Prison opened its steel gates. Designed to hold over 2,000 of the most dangerous and politically influential inmates, PBSP was created for one purpose: to isolate and immobilize high-level gang members. Its architecture reflected this mission. The prison was divided into two worlds: general population and the infamous security housing unit, known nationwide simply as the SHU. The SHU is not just a building. It is a philosophy. It was engineered as a fortress within a fortress. A concrete labyrinth of 8 by 10-foot cells with no windows, no direct sunlight, and almost no sound. Inmates held here were stripped of nearly every human comfort. No contact visits, no group programs, no physical interaction, and no yard in the normal sense. Only a dog-run concrete pen, fully isolated, partially lit by the sky, but surrounded by walls high enough to block almost every horizon. For some inmates, this place would become home for 10, 15, even 20 years straight. To the public, the SHU was controversial. To prison officials, it was necessary. To the gangs, it was a declaration of war. Before Pelican Bay, gang leaders communicated freely in general population yards. They orchestrated criminal activity through coded notes passed by porters, contraband phones, or even legal mail. They met with members daily. They walked the yards with authority. Pelican Bay changed all that. When the state transferred dozens of top-tier members from each major prison gang into Pelican Bay's SHU, it effectively cut off the heads of California's criminal hydra. At least, that was the plan. But the reality was more complicated. Pelican Bay didn't just become a place where violence was suppressed. It became a pressure cooker. A world where the most dangerous inmates were forced into isolation, and forced to evolve. Prison gangs adapted quickly. They developed new communication strategies. Elaborate codes and legal documents, invisible messages written in urine and human kites. Inmates willing to relay spoken messages during medical trips or transportation. Meanwhile, inside the SHU, the atmosphere was unlike any other prison on Earth. Inmates woke to silence. Concrete floors stayed cold year-round. Lights never fully dimmed. Days blended into weeks, weeks into years. Some prisoners underwent severe psychological strain, hallucinations, paranoia, depression. Others grew harder, more disciplined, more focused. The SHU wasn't breaking everyone. For some, it was forging them. Correctional officers later said Pelican Bay created a new kind of inmate. One with nothing left to lose, nothing left to fear, and nothing left but the mind. And in this environment, gang leaders became philosophers, strategists, and political organizers. The isolation didn't silence them, it sharpened their ideas. Some orchestrated hunger strikes. Others wrote manifestos. Some even ran criminal empires with more efficiency than when they were on the yard. Pelican Bay became the ultimate paradox. A place designed to stop gang activity, that accidentally became the brain center for it. But the most haunting part of Pelican Bay's story isn't the violence, the isolation, or even the gangs. It's how the prison itself feels alive. Former inmates say that when you enter Pelican Bay, the atmosphere hits you instantly. The fog in Crescent City hangs low, swallowing the sky. The trees loom tall and silent. The air feels colder, heavier. The prison sits like a concrete monolith carved into the wilderness, a place humans were not meant to dwell. One former guard described it perfectly. Pelican Bay isn't just a prison. It's a mood. A mood built from fear, power, silence, and the knowledge that every man inside is battling both the system and himself. In the chapters ahead, we dive deeper into this world, into the SHU, the gang cases that shaped Pelican Bay's identity, the hunger strikes that shook the entire state, and the psychological war fought inside its concrete walls. Pelican Bay's Security Housing Unit, known simply as the SHU, is one of the most infamous incarceration environments in American history. Even among hardened inmates, the SHU inspires a kind of fear that's difficult to put into words. It isn't the violence, they've seen plenty of that. It's not the guards, they've dealt with authority their entire lives. It's not even the gangs, many grew up inside them. The true terror of the SHU is the silence. When an inmate arrives at Pelican Bay's SHU, the process is deliberate and methodical. He's escorted through multiple steel doors, each slamming shut with a mechanical finality that echoes down the hallway. There are no windows, no sounds of inmates yelling from upper tiers, no radios, no distant chatter. The silence hits like a physical force. One former inmate described it as, like walking into the inside of your own head. The cell itself is 8 by 10 feet, concrete walls, stainless steel toilet, a thin mattress, and a slot in the door used for food trays and handcuffs. There's no view of the outside world, no trees, no sky, no people walking by. The only color is the muted gray of cement and steel. Inmates spend 22 to 24 hours a day in this box. There is no communal yard. Instead, each inmate is escorted, alone, to what officials call a yard, but inmates call a dog run. It's a barren concrete exercise pen about the size of a large garage, surrounded by 20-foot walls with a metal grate above. If the weather cooperates, they might see a sliver of the sky. Some inmates go years without seeing a horizon line. Correctional officers say that time works differently in the SHU. Days slide into each other. Weeks disappear. Birthdays, holidays, and seasons lose meaning. Without sunlight or clocks, a man's internal rhythm breaks. Some inmates adapt. Many unravel. This is where California placed its most powerful gang members. Leaders of the Mexican Mafia, the Aryan Brotherhood, Nuestra Familia, and the Black Guerrilla Family, men who once commanded entire yards, found themselves in complete isolation. It was the ultimate attempt to neutralize them. But in this environment, something unexpected happened. Isolation created thinkers. Instead of being crushed, gang leaders in the SHU developed new forms of discipline. Many began daily routines that resembled military training. Thousands of push-ups, stretches, running in place, reading legal texts, writing coded letters. Some exercised until they vomited, then kept going. Others read philosophy, law, and political theory, turning their cells into classrooms. One former SHU inmate recalled walking past a cell door where a gang leader had taped up dozens of handwritten legal documents, studying case law for hours a day. These guys weren't just sitting around, he said. They were preparing for war in the only battlefield left, the mind. But the SHU wasn't only creating discipline. It was creating pressure. Communication between gang members became increasingly sophisticated. With no direct contact, no group meetings, and heavy surveillance on mail, inmates had to build covert systems. They wrote messages in microscopic handwriting, hidden between the lines of legal paperwork, something staff legally could not read without court permission. Some used milk or urine as invisible ink. Others memorized long sequences of coded words, repeating them silently until they could deliver them during medical escorts. One whispered phrase to another inmate, passed along like a verbal chain. What emerged was an underground communication network that no one had anticipated. A prison telegraph system powered by boredom, intelligence, and absolute determination. Correctional staff would later admit that Pelican Bay didn't eliminate gang activity, it simply forced it to evolve. The SHU also changed the relationship between inmates and guards. Contrary to what many imagine, violence in the SHU wasn't constant. It couldn't be. Inmates were locked down too tightly. Instead, tension built quietly, concentrating like a storm behind concrete walls. Officers walking the tier described the sensation of being watched constantly. Even with their training and authority, they knew that the minds behind those steel cell doors were always calculating, always analyzing, always listening. Some inmates were polite and quiet. Others paced endlessly, muttering. Some clung to routine. Others slid into psychosis. Medical reports documented hallucinations, insomnia, paranoia, and cognitive decline in long-term SHU residents. Some men began talking to themselves or yelling at ghosts. Others became hyper-disciplined to avoid losing their grip. The SHU wasn't just a housing unit, it was a psychological experiment, one that lasted for decades. But the darkest part of Pelican Bay's SHU wasn't the cells or the silence. It was the validation system. Under California's old gang management policy, an inmate could be sent to the SHU indefinitely, not for committing violence, not for breaking rules, but for being validated as a gang member. Validation could be triggered by artwork containing gang symbols, a name mentioned in another inmate's letter, being photographed with suspected affiliates, possessing certain books, receiving a kite from someone on a watch list. Once validated, the sentence was indefinite. You could spend decades in the SHU with no release date. The only way out? Debriefing, confessing your gang involvement and telling officials everything you knew. For many inmates, this was a death sentence. Debriefers were marked as traitors. Some never made it to the transition unit alive. So many remained in the SHU for years. Some for life. The validation system created an entire ecosystem of men trapped in suspended time, locked in a cold box with nothing but their thoughts, their anger, their gang identity, and the knowledge that no matter how many days passed, it wasn't going to end. But the SHU also produced something no one saw coming. A rebellion that would change the entire California prison system forever. A rebellion planned from inside the most isolated place on earth. Most people assume prison gangs will never work together. Their rivalries run decades deep, rooted in blood, politics, race, and ideology. The Mexican Mafia and Nuestra Familia had been in open war since the 1960s. The Aryan Brotherhood and Black Guerrilla Family had fought brutal battles across multiple prisons. These groups had killed each other's members, launched coordinated riots, and controlled different parts of the California prison system like hostile nations. And yet, at Pelican Bay's security housing unit, one of the most restrictive, isolated, psychologically crushing environments ever built, something happened that no one had predicted. The leaders of these rival gangs found common ground. They were all trapped in the SHU. They all faced indefinite isolation. They all understood they could die in these cells without ever seeing a yard, a horizon, or another human face again. And more importantly, every one of them knew the same truth. California wasn't going to change unless they forced it to. The moment that lit the fuse came around 2011, when several long-term SHU inmates, men who had spent 10, 15, 20 years in isolation, began writing and sharing what would become an historic document, the Agreement to End Hostilities. It was a radical idea. The major prison gangs, enemies who had murdered each other's brothers, would temporarily suspend all racial and political hostilities to focus on a single goal: ending long-term solitary confinement. This was more than a truce. It was a strategic alliance designed in conditions where no one thought alliances were even possible. The SHU, meant to prevent communication, had ironically created the perfect storm for it. Isolation stripped away the day-to-day distractions of gang life. With nothing but time and concrete, leaders reflected, debated, and plotted. And because SHU inmates were often the highest-ranking members, the decisions they made carried enormous weight. They drafted a manifesto. They distributed it, slowly, covertly, through legal mail, coded letters, and word of mouth. It spread across Pelican Bay, across other SHUs, and eventually across the entire California prison system. By July 2011, the unthinkable was ready. The Pelican Bay Hunger Strike. The strike begins. On July 1, 2011, SHU inmates across Pelican Bay refused breakfast trays. Then lunch. Then dinner. Within 48 hours, the strike had spread to prisons across California. Thousands of inmates refused food, men from rival gangs, races, cities, and ideologies. It was the largest coordinated prisoner protest in California history. Correctional officers were stunned. Administrators were caught off guard. Lawmakers were forced to respond. But the men in the SHU weren't done. They issued 5 core demands including: end indefinite SHU confinement, stop group punishment, modify the validation process, provide programs and basic human contact, allow prisoners to retain personal property and access to educational materials. These weren't outrageous demands, they were basic human rights issues. But the state refused to budge. After 3 weeks, with multiple inmates hospitalized and one reported near death, the strike slowed. But the message had been delivered. The gangs had pulled off something extraordinary. They had spoken with one voice. But they weren't finished. The second strike, bigger than anyone expected. 2 years later, in 2013, after minimal changes from the state, Pelican Bay inmates launched a second hunger strike, a much larger one. This time, 30,000 prisoners across California participated at its peak. It was one of the largest prison hunger strikes in world history. Media outlets began reporting on the SHU conditions. Photos of the windowless cells, the dog-run yards, the decades-long isolation went national. Psychologists and human rights groups weighed in. Members of the public, many who had never even heard of Pelican Bay, were shocked. The state was under immense pressure. And then, something happened that changed everything. A federal class action lawsuit, Ashker versus Brown, challenged the constitutionality of indefinite solitary confinement. The lawsuit succeeded. In 2015, California settled the case and agreed to end indefinite SHU terms and drastically reform gang validation policies. Thousands of inmates were released from Pelican Bay's SHU into general population units statewide. For the first time in 25 years, Pelican Bay's SHU began to empty. It was one of the most significant shifts in U.S. prison policy in modern history. The gangs, ironically, had forced reform not through violence, but through cooperation, strategy, and the one tool left to them, their bodies. The aftermath, a new era of uncertainty. The end of the SHU's dominance didn't mean Pelican Bay became safe. It simply entered a new chapter. Thousands of inmates, some who had spent more than half their lives in silence, were suddenly back in general population yards. Officials worried violence would explode. Some predicted a statewide gang war. Others believed reintegrating long-term SHU inmates would destabilize prisons for years. And while violence did occur in some facilities, the predicted statewide war never materialized. The agreement to end hostilities, remarkably, continued to hold in many institutions. But Pelican Bay itself changed. Without the SHU functioning as the brain center of isolation, the prison's identity shifted. It remained high security, still dangerous, still isolated in the cold forests of Crescent City, but no longer the psychological black hole it once was. For decades, Pelican Bay represented the extreme edge of punishment in America. It was where California sent the men it believed were too dangerous to exist anywhere else. It was a place built not to rehabilitate but to contain. And yet, from inside the most controlled environment imaginable, the inmates managed to alter the entire system. Their rebellion didn't come from violence, riots, or fear. It came from unity, something no one believed was possible in a world defined by division. Pelican Bay is more than a prison. It is a symbol, a reflection of America's struggle with punishment, power, violence, and reform. It's a place where some of the most dangerous criminals in the country lived in boxes barely bigger than parking spaces, and still found ways to influence the world outside. Its SHU became infamous for pushing human limits, mentally, physically, spiritually. And for decades, it stood as a monument to control. But in the end, Pelican Bay was transformed by the very people it sought to silence. This is the story of a prison built for war. And the men who, despite isolation, found a way to rewrite the rules.